Okay. Hi everyone. I'm obviously not Biksha. I'm Graham Newbig. I'm an assistant professor here, and Biksha invited me to give a guest lecture. Because we're getting to the end of the class and you guys already have a lot of the basics, I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of my recent research. Hopefully it will be interesting. And also, hopefully, it will give an example of some of the things that you can do with the concepts you learned in the class, including things like reinforcement learning, or I'm going to be talking about things like variational autoencoders. I'll also be talking about something called normalizing flow, which probably you haven't covered in the class, I guess. But it's an interesting concept that might be good to know as well. And this is research with 3 PhD students at LTI and also Taylor Berg-Kirkpatrick, who was at LTI until very recently and now is at UCSD. And feel free to ask questions whenever. So one of the points of our work here is that we want to basically learn neural networks with interpretable structure, or that are interpretable in some way. And there's a lot of different ways to do this. Have you talked about any methods for interpreting neural networks in this class at all? Or?
I think we did something for, I think you can tell from the gradients of the image.
Okay, yeah, so, okay, that's a good example. And this example is basically you take a black box neural network and you do some sort of analysis over this neural network, like looking at the gradients that feed back into an image. And from this, you achieve something interpretable. In this particular case, I'm going to be talking about language. So some examples of things are syntax and semantics. But it could also be image patches that influenced your decision, et cetera. But what I'm going to talk about this time instead is neural networks that have some sort of structure inside them. Latent structure inside them that make them inherently interpretable. And also, so you can kind of look at the structures that the neural network used in its training in order to figure out what kind of things it's learned or using in its learning. So the problem is, the reason why we use neural networks is kind of these fundamentally interpretable models that are already interpretable in the first place. For example, in language processing, we have hidden Markov models. These are not sufficiently powerful to do well. So this is the reason why we use things like LSTMs or other things like this. So then the question becomes, how can we harness the power of neural networks that have underlying interpretable representations? And how can we learn them on unlabeled data? So on data where we don't necessarily have labeled representations in the first place. So I think basically all of the examples I'm going to talk about this time are based on some sort of syntactic analysis of sentences. I don't know if you've handled any things like this in this class. Probably not, right? So some examples of this would be things like predicting the parts of speech of a sentence, or predicting dependency graphs for a sentence, where dependency graphs are the relationships between edges in a sentence, words in a sentence. And the standard way of doing something like this is a supervised approach, where you have lots of labeled data that gives you both text on the input side and these structures on the output side. And then you train the neural network to predict these structures, syntactic structures from text. Now, this is good, and this works really well if you have lots of data. So, for example, a really easy way to do this for part of speech tagging, for example, would be you take 2 LSTMs in both directions. You take a bidirectional LSTM, and you directly optimize it to maximize the likelihood of a part of speech tag that you found. This is a standard thing that probably all of you have learned in this class or done in this class. What I'm going to talk about here instead is a version of this where we don't actually necessarily have the annotated latent structures. And because we don't have these annotated latent structures, we need to learn them in some way. So what we do is we define some sort of generative model where we assume that first we generate the structure. So this is saying basically we generate the structure of what we want to say first, and then from the structure of what we want to say, we generate the text. And in this case, does anyone know what this text is? This is actual language. This is cuneiform. It's a language that nobody on Earth, it's a script that nobody on Earth uses anymore, but it's from a long, long time ago in Southeast Europe and Africa. So if we're given this text, what we do is basically we assume that we have some sort of underlying structure of it that's allowing us to generate this text, but we don't know what that structure is, so we want to learn it. And I'm going to be talking about yeah. Okay, so some examples of it is,
Is that a rule? Or?
Some examples of it would be part of speech sequences or dependency graphs.
So you just generate a rule like from the...
Right. So we assume that we have certain, I'll give some details later, but we assume we have certain like models of this. We have a model of like the likely structures, and then from the structures we generate the outputs. Another example, let's say we wanted to talk about images, would be, let's say we have a model that we want to learn bounding boxes around things in an image. The underlying structure could be the bounding boxes, and then given the bounding boxes and the IDs of the things in the bounding boxes, you could generate an image.
Now in the class, you first like do some sort of segmentation.
That would be, yeah, exactly the case. So the good thing about that is then you would have a model that basically generates images based on these bounding boxes, and you could go back and examine these bounding boxes and say, oh, maybe there's an object here, and maybe we should be looking at that. So I'm going to be talking about a couple tools that we've developed to do this. A lot of these are specifically designed for something where you have some sort of structure, and we apply all of them to language because I'm a language person, but a lot of these are kind of general and might be are applicable to other things. And this example here is something that's general and could be applicable to other things like image classification if you wanted to do so. So we have, this is called multi-space variational encoder decoders. And I'm going to specifically be talking about models of words in this particular case, but if you substitute this as models of images, similarly you could have a similar, you could use it applied in that direction as well. But each word in a sentence has multiple features, like for example, what syntactic features does the word have? And these are closed class. They are generally enumerable for a specific language. Whereas something like meaning, what is the meaning of the word, how is it spelled or pronounced? These are open class, and there are complicated regularities and relationships between them. So for example, if you say decide and decided, this is the present tense and the past tense. There's only a limited number of tenses of a word, but there's basically a nearly infinite, not infinite, but an extremely large number of actual words, like decide, reject, run, etc. So that's what I mean by syntax versus the meaning and the symbol of the word. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to create a model that elegantly models both of these. And we did this based on variational autoencoders. Have variational autoencoders been covered here? OK, great. So basically, a variational autoencoder, from the point of view of covering words, is you have the recognition model, which generates a latent variable. Usually, this is a continuous vector latent variable. And from this, we generate again. And this is a generative model where we have a prior over the continuous vector latent variables, and then our generation model generates the output. And based on this, we maximize the variational lower bound of the likelihood, where we sample latent variables from the inference model, and calculate the log likelihood according to this. And then we penalize the inference model when it makes predictions that are very different from some sort of prior probability that we have. So the proposed model that we came up with is something called multi-space variational encoder decoders. The idea is we have a word, and we have a latent continuous variable. This is supposed to model the open class meaning or spelling or pronunciation of the word. And then we also have a number of latent discrete variables. And these latent discrete variables essentially model the closed class features of the word. So like, for example, this is a past tense. This is a past tense word. It's a verb. It has a certain person, et cetera. And then from this, we can regenerate the word, or we can even generate a different word, like played, that has the same underlying meaning, but different like syntactic characteristics, or something like this. So the modeling the complicated higher level structure, such as the meaning or the symbol, we do this through the latent continuous variables. In modeling the closed class and interpretable features, such as the syntactic features, we do through the discrete latent variables. So based on this, if we have plays, played, and playing, all of these have the same underlying meaning. They would all be mapped into a similar latent continuous variable, while the discrete variables would be different. And then the question is, how can we learn this in an unsupervised or semi-supervised way? So to give a few variable definitions, we have XS is a source sequence. Z is a continuous latent variable. YT is discrete labels for each target sequence. We could have one, or we could have multiple ones. And then XT is the target sequence. So first, we consider a supervised learning setting where which we call labeled multi-space variational autoencoders. And in this case, we have training data, which is a word, a surface form of a word, which is just the characters in the word, and some discrete labels. And from this, what we can do is we can learn the parameters of the inference model and the parameters of the generation model, and also the latent continuous variables here. So what we do is we predict the latent continuous variables, and then we have a decoder that basically takes in the latent continuous variable, the discrete label, and generates the output here. So the good thing about this is basically this allows us to learn this is completely the same as a normal variational autoencoder. We are learning the latent continuous space, and we're learning the parameters of the decoder, with the only difference that we're also conditioning based on these discrete labels here. So are there any questions about this?
Like the discrete, is it integer values or
These are like one-hot vectors. You can think about them as one-hot vectors. In reality, what we do is we have the labels. They're one-hot vectors. We embed them using basically something like word embeddings, and then we do attention over the labels as we're generating the output. But yeah.
So is this based on just words? So when you say sequence, it's just one word, or does it also do like sentence transformation and also like change sentences?
So theoretically, this could do anything. In this particular case, we did it over words, but you could also have a sentence where you said this sentence is a positive sentence that's about sports. And
So how is that different from like when you have word embeddings, you have like when you find these analogies like saying like play to plays and maybe some other words to is third form, like third person form.
OK.
Wouldn't that difference of the word embedding?
That's a very good question. So in that case, you can do analogies between words, but you don't get a label over the word about what type of word it is. So this has the ability through the inference model over the discrete labels to tell you what type of word it is. Also, you could do something in We didn't try this. Maybe it would have been interesting to try, but you could theoretically say, okay, I want you to convert this word. I want you to convert decide in the same way that play is converted to plays. And then if you tried to do it by analogy, you could maybe get decides out of this. But here what you specifically say is not, don't convert decide to something like you would convert play to plays. You say instead, convert decide to the third person form. So you can explicitly say what type of transformation you want to do with a label on the transformations. So to give a few other analogies that people might be more interested in, you could say, okay, this sentence has positive sentiment. This sentence is a positive sentence. Please convert it into a negative sentence. And then in order to do that, you would need to have discrete labels over positive and negative here. Or this image has a cat, converted into an image that has a dog. So then we also train a discriminative label classifier, and this is basically our inference model queue over here. And because we have the labels in this case in our training data, we can just train this using normal log likelihood. So we maximize the variational lower bound over this joint probability here. So this is a pretty normal thing. We're doing completely supervised learning. Now, the interesting thing is, can we do this in an unsupervised learning setting as well? Or maybe a semi-supervised learning setting where we have a small amount of labeled data and a large amount of unlabeled data? And what we do is, in this case, we have only words, or only surface forms of words, only sequences. And we don't have any information about the labels. What we do in this case is we have our inference model predict the latent continuous variable. We have our separate inference model over the latent discrete variables also predict the latent discrete variables. And then we have our decoder here generate the output. And our log likelihood here is basically, our training objective here is basically the standard variational autoencoder training objective where we just have two types of variables, one latent and one discrete. Optimizing over the discrete variables is a little bit harder than optimizing over the continuous variables, but it's possible to do, and I'll talk about that in a second. So the good thing about this is this allows us to also learn from unlabeled data. So we don't need all our data to be labeled with labels in order to use this. And then the other interesting thing is that we don't necessarily only need to train this using data where the input and the output are the same. What we can do is we can train an encoder-decoder where we have a surface form on the input side, a surface form on the output side, and we know that these two are basically have the same underlying meaning. They have the same lemma. And we would like to transform from play into plays. And we know the labels of the output. So what we do in this case is we predict the latent continuous variable. And then in the decoder, we predict the output. So this is interesting because basically what this does is this forces the latent continuous variable to be the same for these two different sentences, or two different words that mean the same thing. So this enforces that words that mean the same thing. As long as we have this training data, we'll get very similar lemmas, latent continuous variables. And here we optimize the variational lower bound of the target tags and words. So I'll go through the. Oh, sorry. You have a question?
Is it possible because in English most of the forms are kind of consistently morphologically? Or is it going to work if there's a language in which every word has a different form in its third-person form, say?
This actually works better in those cases. So the more complicated, the more complicated this is, the better this works in relation to other simpler methods.
How would that learn in a label? Because it doesn't have any rule to learn from other words. It just has to learn.
Well, the labels, if there was absolutely no consistency whatsoever between words, then you couldn't learn anything, of course, because you need to have some sort of consistency. But in any language, there's consistency.
And you're saying that if the classes are like more complicated, it's actually easier to learn?
This works better than other alternatives. So other alternatives are things that don't learn these latent variables, and I'll talk about them in the experiments, but yeah. So maybe the kind of interesting part, I don't know, you probably have, or actually I don't know, maybe you have covered this in this class, but the question here is how to learn these things. So learning continuous latent variables, in order to do this, you can use the reparameterization trick in variational autoencoders. This you've covered here, maybe? Oh, okay. So variational autoencoders, one thing that makes them relatively easy to train is there's a trick that you can do that allows you to back propagate all the way through, despite the fact that you are sampling despite the fact that you're sampling within the kind of computation of the neural network loss function. So normally, there are certain things that you can't do in a neural network loss function and still be able to backpropagate all the way through. So for example, you can't take an argmax. You can't sample. Have you talked about this at all? No.
I didn't talk about the trick.
But it has to do with something called double groups?
That's actually the second one that I'm going to talk about. But the first one, so basically the problem with doing things like sampling or calculating an argmax function within a neural network is, let's say we talk about the discrete case. In the discrete case, let's say we have a probability distribution that looks like this, with three probabilities where this is like 0.2, 0.35, and 0.45. And the argmax operation over this distribution, basically what it does is it takes the highest scoring value and it gives it a one-hot vector. So if you do this, the problem with this is this is not a continuously differentiable function. Basically, its gradient is 0 almost everywhere. And then suddenly when this value gets smaller than this value, you switch over to something else like this. So because of this, you can't put an argmax, you can't put a sampling operation in the middle of a computation graph and still backpropagate through it. So this is very important as you're implementing things. If you accidentally put something like this in your TensorFlow code or PyTorch code or something like this, this will break learning, essentially. And this is a very, very important thing to know. You need to make sure all the operations in your graph are differentiable or subdifferentiable. So the reason why the variational autoencoder, it basically has a sampling operation within the learning where you take your inference network and you sample according to your inference network, and then you calculate the probability of the reconstruction model according to the sample. The reason why you're able to do this and still backpropagate all the way through is basically, actually I'll pull up this is a very good tutorial, by the way. The original variational autoencoder paper is quite difficult to understand, but this is very, very easy compared to it. So basically what you do instead is The normal way that you would use a variational autoencoder is on the left, where you would do a sampling operation after you've done your encoder, which is the red box here, and then you would feed that into your decoder. What you do instead is you do a sampling operation down here, and then you multiply this and add it, multiply it by the covariance matrix calculated by the encoder. You add the mean, and then you feed it into the decoder. And because of this, there's no non-differentiable sampling operation inside the computation graph. So this allows you to learn. And this is called the reparameterization trick. And this is very important. Again, I highly recommend this. This is really, really nice. We can do this for the continuous variables. You can see here we're doing the same thing. We're basically multiplying the covariance and adding the mean. For discrete latent variables, we can use the Gumbel softmax trick. So the Gumbel softmax trick, basically what we do is we sample Gumbel noise. This is something you covered. Is this something you covered in the class, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Categorical. So essentially adding them becomes a good distribution.
Yep, exactly. So this is what you can do here. You basically sample noise according to the Gumbel distribution, something called the Gumbel distribution, which is like minus log of the uniform distribution. And if you do this, this is basically sampling according to the Gumbel distribution, and taking the argmax is similar to taking a sample from the original distribution. And then instead of taking the argmax, you can take a softmax instead. And I won't cover all the details here, but if you're interested, you can look at the Gumbel softmax paper. It's very, very useful for these models. So one other thing about variational autoencoders is that in the case where you have a very strong decoder model, where you have a very strong generation model, they have the unfortunate tendency to basically collapse into having z be equal to basically a zero vector all the time, have z be completely uninformative. The reason why they do this is basically at the beginning of learning, if you're generating kind of uninformative z vectors, the generation model isn't able to use them appropriately, and the model isn't able to learn that it needs to be generating good z values here. So there's a bunch of different tricks that you can use to fix this, but the most common one is there's a KL divergence term in the variational autoencoder objective that I showed right here. This KL divergence term is basically pushing the inference model to be similar to the prior. And normally, if you collapse, basically this KL divergence term is too strong at the beginning of training and forces this posterior here to be exactly the same as the prior. So what you do is at the beginning of training, you just ignore this completely, and you don't use the KL divergence term. You just use this term on the left. And then as training progresses, you gradually increase the weight of this KL divergence term. And this is a common trick in using these for both language, where you have a strong RNN-based decoder, or for images, where you when you're using something like a recurrent neural network, like a pixel RNN or something like this. So this is a common trick. We actually there's also a bunch of other tricks to fix this problem, but this trick is easy and one that people often use. We also, to make the decoder weaker, to help prevent this from happening, we also dropped out the input to the decoder with a certain probability. But that's a little bit less important and less common. The KL divergence annealing thing here is pretty common. Are there any questions? So this is a model. I can talk a little bit about experiments. OK. So in the experimental setup, we did a task called morphological reinflection. This is what all my examples are from. This is a general model that could be used for a bunch of other things as well, but this is the one thing that we tested extensively on. And basically the idea here is you get a source word like communicated and a target word like communicates, and you also get target labels that say the kind of syntactic features of the output target word. And given the source word and the target labels, you need to generate the target word. And we tried this on a bunch of different languages, on more complicated languages, including things like Turkish and Finnish, etc. And here are the results. The input here, the med single example here, is basically a attention-based model with that inputs the tags and the input sequence and generates the output sequence. The difference between our model here and their model here is that we actually don't have any concept of attention over the input characters. So the, whoops. You'll see our model here. We're actually not directly looking at the input characters when we generate the output. We're first encoding all of the input characters into this single continuous vector and then generating the output. So the thing that I think is pretty interesting and impressive is that despite the fact that we're kind of basically forgetting everything about the input characters, we're still able to get, not forgetting, but we're encoding everything about the input characters in a single vector. We're still able to get competitive accuracy compared to this. This bidirectional thing here, this BD means bidirectional. Basically, we trained in both directions. We trained in the forward direction and we trained in the backward direction. And then the semi-supervised one is where we took a bunch of data from Wikipedia and trained in a semi-supervised fashion, where we, instead of having labels for all of the input and output pairs, we didn't have any labels, and we trained using our semi-supervised objective.
So you add data on top of supervised?
Yep, exactly. But it doesn't have any true labels. So yeah.
Just out of quick curiosity, so assuming you forget about the discrete variables, what about the accuracy you're looking at? If it's only an output?
If we didn't have any discrete variables, probably it wouldn't work very well at all. And the reason why is because the discrete variables are telling you what the tags of the output should be. And that's really important for this task, because basically our job is to go from the source word and the target labels into the target word.
Yeah, I mean,
but
if you forget about the transformation from communicated to just like an autoencoder communicates to communicate.
oh,
What are the accuracy you're looking at?
That's a good question. If it was just an autoencoder, I think you could probably get it to work pretty well, but I don't think we actually tested that. So yeah. And any other things? Okay. So yeah, okay, and that's the summary. And this is an example of the attention that we're doing over the tags when we generate. But maybe the more interesting thing is we didn't actually tell the model which words meant the same thing or which words had the same lemmas explicitly, other than through the training objective. But we post hoc took a bunch of words that had the same lemma or the same meaning, and we colored them differently on here, and then did a t-SNE visualization of the latent space. And you can see that the latent space, within the latent space, things with the same meaning tend to group together. So it was able to learn to group things together. Very well for Maltese, a little bit less well for Turkish, but these are both relatively complicated languages. So this is all for the multi-space variational encoder decoders. Are there any follow-up things here? Okay. So next I'll talk about something a little bit different. This is very similar in the variational autoencoder paradigm. The difference here is that instead of having latent variables that are continuous vectors or discrete vectors of tags. We rather have variables that are actually structured outputs. So specifically, we're interested in more complicated structures, and the thing that we tested on was a task called semantic parsing. In semantic parsing, the idea is to go from English or any natural language to a structured output representation encoding the meaning of the language in a way that a computer can use it to process something. So one example would be database lookup queries expressed in a database lookup language. Another example that I'm particularly interested in is going from English into English commands into source code. So basically English to Python translation. So if you're coding and suddenly don't know how to do something, instead of going to Stack Overflow, you just tell your computer what you want to do and it generates the code for you. Yeah. Is there something?
Wolframalpha?
What? I'm sorry, I don't.
It's online.
Sorry, I just couldn't hear what you said.
Wolfram?
Oh, Wolframalpha. Yeah. So it's another example of this. So they're doing semantic parsing within Wolframalpha. Yep. I think actually they're almost entirely a rule-based system. They took a lot of effort to come up with these rules, and I don't think they're using machine learning inside. But it does work quite well. It's pretty impressive. So the research issue here is that neural models are data hungry, but the data sets that we have for these tasks are actually relatively small. So for example, we created a data set with 3,000 Python snippets and the corresponding explanations from Stack Overflow, and this cost us about $1,700 to create this data set. And let's say you wanted to apply it to a new domain or apply it to a particular company's code base or something like this, you would have to create more data, and this would be onerous, I guess. So what we want to do is we want to do semi-supervised prediction of these structured representations using a small amount of labeled data and then lots of other unlabeled utterances here. And in addition, it would be really nice if we could use unlabeled code. So like download all the code from Stack Overflow and use this to, from GitHub or something and use this to improve our model as well. So we have labeled data where we have pairs, and then we have unlabeled data where we have just utterances and just output structure. So the reason why I'm saying structure about code is because all code has structure. There's something called an abstract syntax tree that expresses the structure of the code in a way that a compiler or interpreter can process it appropriately. And as our latent meaning representation, we use these tree-structured variables. And it's a variational autoencoder, so it's a generative model. We assume it's a generative model of the text utterance, and we have a prior, where this prior is over the trees, the latent tree structures. We have this structured latent space where each of these possible trees is basically a program, this abstract syntax tree. So we generate a tree from this prior, and then from our reconstruction model, we generate the utterance like this. So you can see this is like a standard variational autoencoders generative story, except instead of having this be a continuous vector, we have this be a tree expressing this, the semantics or syntax of the output. And we also have an inference model, which goes from an utterance into this tree like this. And I should stress that here specifically I'm talking about, ASTs and programs and stuff, but this could also be applied to, other types of structure, tree structures as well. The posterior inference model here This corresponds to basically a semantic parsing or code generation model. So this is a thing that goes from an utterance to the actual structure that we want to have. Are there any questions about this so far? No? OK. So for our semi-supervised learning with the struct VAE, we have a supervised learning objective where these are our labeled data. And we also have an unsupervised objective. I think this is a mistake. This should actually be the probability of the utterance. So we have our unsupervised objective where we want to optimize the probability of this utterance over all of the utterances in our training data. So how do we do this? Oh yeah, sorry. And the probability of the utterance, like in the VAE, is an integration of the over all of the trees with the prior probability multiplied by the reconstruction model probability here. So how do we do this? The answer is we have to define a prior, a reconstruction model, and an inference model. In this case, for the prior and the reconstruction model, we used a neural language model over trees, over the trees, and a neural sequence model from trees to utterances. And just to make things easier, just for convenience, what we did was we used linearized trees. So we basically traversed the trees in pre-order traversal, and we turned them into like sequences of tokens, more or less. And I guess in the case of code, we just maybe tokenized the code and used the tokenized code as a sequence. So for the inference model, we used an actual strong parser that generates tree structures, which I'll talk about in a second.
One question, that should be, so the unsupervised objective?
Yeah.
That should be the data, or should be?
Yeah, this shouldn't be the tree. This should be the utterance. Sorry, that's a typo there. So in order to do the variational approximation of the marginal likelihood, which should be in the left side there, what we do is, like the variational autoencoder, we sample according to this model. So if we have a sequence-sequence model or a sequence-to-tree model in our case, it's relatively easy to sample structures. And then we optimize this likelihood here. And we also subtract the KL divergence between the prior probability over the trees and in this model here. Yeah.
So the tree structure, is it the leaves and the roots, are they either fixed, or there could be multiple trees? Or is it just one tree that you just fill in different things?
So the tree structure is not fixed at all. The tree structure is
So when you're sampling from like all the trees?
All the possible trees, yeah.
There is a way to do that.
Right. So we have a sequence-to-tree model, which basically I'll explain it in a second, and then it should be clear how we sample. So the good thing here is also this prior that we define. This prior can be trained over a huge amount of tree-structured data. Like it could be trained over all the code on GitHub. This here could be trained over all the utterances that we get from a user that we want to be parsing. So this doesn't need to have labels. But we do need a small amount of data to bootstrap the inference model and the reconstruction model. And we use a small amount of labeled data to do that. So how does the extra unlabeled data help the learning? So in the supervised training objective, basically what the derivative of the inference model, basically the model that we actually are most interested in training, is this model that goes from utterances to interpretations or to trees. The derivative looks like this. It's just the log likelihood of the tree given the utterance. But in the unsupervised case, we have a sampled tree, and the derivative looks like this, but it's the derivative of the sampled tree multiplied by some learning signal. And specifically, this learning signal, what this learning signal looks like, there's another typo here. This should be the log probability, the sum of the log probabilities of these two. And the learning signal is basically the prior probability and the reconstruction model probability. So the idea here, the core idea here, is basically the learning signal acts as tuning the weights of the gradients by the sampled latent meaning representations. And to give a more concrete example, if we have sort my list in descending order, and we have an output of sorted my list, this is natural Python. This is natural code or tree structure. So the prior probability is high, but the reconstruction model, sorry, there's lots of typos here. This should be in the opposite direction on the right side. It should be the probability of the utterance given the tree. The reconstruction model here, will have trouble generating the words in descending order given just this code, right? Because this code has deleted the idea of descending order whatsoever, so it wouldn't be able to regenerate the original utterance. On the other hand, if we have the true answer, this is natural Python, so the prior probability will be high, and the reconstruction model probability will be high. And in the last case, the prior probability will be low because this is unnatural Python, even if the reconstruction model might be able to use this. So you can see that basically the learning signal will favor sampled latent meaning representations that both faithfully encode the semantics of the original utterance and get a high reconstruction score, and are succinct and natural and get a high prior probability. Is this clear, or any questions? No? OK. So for the inference model, what we use is a transition-based parser. It transduces natural language utterances into abstract syntax trees. We have a parser that basically the way it works is we define a grammar over the input, and based on the grammar, it generates actions that we can then convert into the abstract syntax tree. The details I won't cover in detail. You can go back and read the paper if you want to. But the important thing here is it generates one action at a time. And because it generates one action at a time, you're calculating a softmax over the possible actions. And you can sample from that softmax to sample full trees. So at the very beginning, you sample the first action. Based on the first action, you sample the next action. Based on the next action, you sample the next action. So this is a method called Ancestral Sampling that allows you to sample kind of these bigger structures from smaller individual decisions. Are there any questions about this, or is it OK? OK. So for the data sets, we used a Django Python code generation task and also a semantic parsing task. So the first one is generating Python. The second one is generating basically database queries. And our research questions are basically, does struct VAE, the method that we propose, outperform purely supervised methods? And also, can we get some empirical evidence about why this works? And I think both of these are interesting, maybe, if you want to think about using something like this in your own work. But struct VAE versus baselines. The first baseline we used was just purely supervised learning. The second baseline we used was something called self-training, where basically we used the original parser trained on a small amount of data to generate trees for a larger amount of data, and then retrain the model based on these generated trees. And in this case, we didn't get consistent gains. Basically, it seems to be the gains were good sometimes and bad other times. oh, sorry, the x-axis here is the amount of labeled data. So this is a very low data scenario to a relatively high data scenario. And then our method is the final method here, and this got consistent gains over both of these methods in all of the data scenarios. And particularly, when we had very few data, we were able to get the largest gains in our accuracy. So why did this actually work? One interesting thing about this data set is in this data set, we actually have all of the correct labels, even for the data that we're using as quote unquote unlabeled data. So what we did here was we plotted the learning signal that we got from the case when the sampled tree was the correct tree versus when we had the other incorrect trees. And you can see pretty clearly that the incorrect trees, the learning signal that we get from them is lower than the learning signal that we get from the correct trees. And the good thing about this is you notice there's some overlap, so the learning signal isn't perfect in picking out the things that we should be learning from. But it's, on average, significantly better than when we have the correct output. So, and to give some concrete examples of this, we have join P and command into a file path, substitute it for F. In this case, we have P, F equals os.path.join, and P equals path.join, P command. And we can see that in this case, both the prior is reasonable for both of these, but the reconstruction score is much better for the case where we get the actual command correct, probably because it allows us to generate F accurately. And in the second case, we have primary keys equals pks.split. In this case, the prior is much higher for the output that is canonical Python, because the neural language model is able to determine that this is more natural as Python than this one. So that's the end of the second part. Are there any questions about this? Or? Okay. So I'll go into the final one. The final one, this is going from a semi-supervised setting to a fully unsupervised setting. And in the fully unsupervised setting, what we're doing here is we're trying to go to basically, instead of finding some sort of labels from a small amount of labeled data and a large amount of unlabeled data, rather find labels when we don't have any labeled data whatsoever. And one standard way to do this, as I mentioned before, is to train something called a hidden Markov model. Have people handled this in other classes? Okay. So to train a hidden Markov model, basically what this is this has some latent states, Z, maybe 10 or 50 latent states Z. And based on the latent state Z, you have transition probabilities between the hidden states and then emission probabilities that say, given this particular state, what is the probability of outputting a the or something like this. And the idea is that by combining these two together, you'll get classes that basically cluster these words together in a coherent way. And there's a modification of this, a simple modification of this that basically says, instead of outputting with a multinomial distribution over all of the words, instead we want to output word embeddings. The reason being that word embeddings basically encode lots of information about words, right? So what you do is instead of defining a multinomial distribution over all of the words in your vocabulary, you define a Gaussian distribution over the word embedding space. So the advantage of this is word embeddings with similar part-of-speech tags or similar characteristics will tend to cluster in the word embedding space, and this will make it easier to learn. So the problem with this method is we actually did a t-SNE visualization of the word embedding space based on the part-of-speech tag, the most common part-of-speech tag of this particular word. And what we can see is that the different colors represent different part of speech tags. And while there is some consistency, like all the red ones are over here, the orange ones are over here, there's a lot of kind of mixing up of these tags. So they're not as consistent as we'd like. Go ahead.
The word embedding here, is that word to vec or is it actually trained on?
This is word to vec, yeah, or maybe fast text, but something that's completely trained based on that. So so basically the word embeddings are pre-trained. If the word embeddings are not pre-trained and you learn them jointly, it actually becomes kind of a degenerate problem for reasons that I'll talk about later.
I was wondering, because if you train embedding for the purpose of QoS tagging, wouldn't it be better to just learn to sort of learn tag itself without
That's a good question. It's actually a two-part question. So let's say we wanted to do supervised part of speech tagging, where we have labeled part of speech data. In that case, it's much more effective to pre-train the word embeddings, and the reason why is simply because our labeled part of speech data is very small, but our word embedding data is big. We can use raw text. The second part of the question is actually what we're doing here is we're doing unsupervised part of speech induction, so we don't have any labeled data, so we can't do that trivially. So we run word to vec first, and then we do inference over the things to try to basically cluster things together. So this is a problem because you can see that things are kind of spread out in different parts of the space. And we have a method, the method that we propose basically tries to fix this problem. And what we do is we have these latent variables z, which are according to kind of a hidden Markov model structure. And then each of these hidden Markov model states has a Gaussian, a regular Gaussian, like the ones we're used to. But then in addition to this, we have a projection of this probability space into a more complicated probability space. And the idea here is that actually, if the word embeddings for the dark blue part of speech tag, I don't know what this one are all kind of around the outside, we can take a Gaussian that's in this part of the space, and then we can essentially manipulate the Gaussian so that it covers all of these dark blue portions in the appropriate way, in a way that would maximize the likelihood of the model. And of course, we don't have these supervised labels, so we can't directly train it to do this, but we hope that optimizing the likelihood of the model will allow us to learn appropriate transformations in this way. And I'll go into more detail in a second. And one important thing here is that in order to learn this model, actually we only have these x's. We only have these word embeddings x's. So not only do we need to be able to project this space into, not only do we need to be able to project this into this, we also want it to be a projection where we can invert the projection and go from the observed word embedding space back into the space of the original Gaussian. So this is called a invertible projection. And this is very useful and important in learning in these models. We have another model for learning trees. I'll skip that because it's less important. So basically, we have a model that looks like this. So the question is, how do we learn this model? So what we want to do is we want to calculate the probability of x given the latent variables and some parameters of the model. And the parameters eta here are the Gaussian parameters that go from z to the latent embedding space. And then the parameters phi are the projection parameters that take us between e and x and e, respectively. The dimensions of x and dimensions of e have to be equal, and f has to be an invertible function. And based on this assumption, there is a very interesting trick. It was first introduced in a paper called Normalizing Flows. Or first introduced in the framework of neural networks based on the framework of normalizing flows, which basically says if you have a model that is trying to optimize a probability over the output x, if your projection is an invertible projection, you can actually optimize the probability over this latent space here that you get from this projection function, as long as you take the probability of the projected value times the determinant of this function here. And the determinant of the Jacobian matrix here. So just to give, let me skip over this. So so this maybe might not be obvious why something like this is necessary. Why do you need to multiply by the determinant? Like why do we need to ensure that a invertible projection is the projection is invertible in the first place? And to think about it in another way, let's say we directly were able to map the observed word embeddings to any place in the space where we were defining Gaussian distributions. We had complete freedom to define a mapping function that went directly from here to here. The problem is that this basically gives us a degenerate solution where we take all of our word embeddings that we've observed anywhere, we map them all to a zero vector. And then we define a Gaussian distribution with zero mean and zero variance over this mapped space. And this gives us essentially infinite likelihood. This gives us, this will say, OK, now we can generate the data with infinite likelihood. But the problem with this is, number one, obviously, this isn't very informative. You just map everything to zero, and you wouldn't get any learning signal. But mathematically, the problem with this is you would never be able to recover these original word embeddings from this because everything would be mapped to zero. And basically, what the determinant is doing is it's penalizing your model for making it's penalizing the transformation for making the space less, or for contracting the space too much, I guess. So yeah, I'm not going to be able to cover this in as much detail as I'd like. Is this class? This class is until when? Till 20 past. OK, good. So I'll try to leave some time for questions at the end and not go all the way to the end. But basically, the idea here is that if we have this kind of degenerate solution, this log determinant will be negative infinity and penalize the transformation infinitely, essentially. So the more you get close to this degenerate solution, you get penalized more. So you have something pulling in both directions. You want a simple, easily invertible transformation, but you also want to maximize the likelihood. So if you can transform a little bit and maximize the likelihood easily, then that's OK. But if you transform too much, you start to get penalized more than the likelihood is penalizing you. So yeah.
What is that? Like, you have to have an F. Is it an MLP or is it
OK, yeah, so that's a good question. So how do we design F? The important thing about F is F needs to be invertible. It also needs to allow you to easily calculate the Jacobian matrix. And calculating a Jacobian matrix is actually very expensive because you need second order derivatives. Fortunately, there are people who have come up with functions where basically it's trivial to calculate the Jacobian matrix. And one example is something like this, where you basically split the original space in half, and then you have these, you have functions that go from one part of the original space and add it into another part of the original space, where the transformation, so this allows you to have basically a diagonal matrix like this, and you can do this back and forth and back and forth. And as long as you take a functional form like this, then you can easily calculate the Jacobian matrix. So it can't be an arbitrary MLP. I mean, it could be, but it would just be extremely computationally intensive. So there's a bunch of different functions like this that allow you to calculate the Jacobian easily, and this is just one example of it. So that's what we used. So we did experiments on unsupervised part-of-speech tagging, where we basically want to find clusters for particular words. Also unsupervised grammar induction, where we want to find tree structures for sentences. Experimental results, this works really well. It works even better than methods with hand-designed features to try to solve this task. But the more interesting thing is, remember we had our original embedding space here. Now let's look what happens after we apply our transformation to it. So we apply our transformation learned using the Markov model prior, and we can see that the things with very similar part-of-speech tags tend to cluster much closer together. So it's learning a transformation that essentially clusters the words according to their part-of-speach tag, which is great. This is exactly what we wanted the model to do, and it seems like it's doing what we wanted it to, and that's probably why the accuracy is going up by a large amount. And interestingly, we also, this DMV thing is a thing where we did tree structure. The space is a little bit different when we use a different prior, when we use this kind of tree-structured prior. And we can see it's still doing much better than the original space, but there are some things that are kind of mixed together. And if you look at this big section here, this has things like plans, clues, details, challenges, uncertainties, dreams, etc. But also things like monopoly, theft, bribery, birth, fund, royalties, process. So these are kind of topically similar things that tend to be the objects of sentences. They tend to be not the subject, but the object of a sentence. And then if we look down here, we have things like aide, resident, owner, politician, associate. And then we also have like smokers, parents, folks, foes, principals. So these are things that tend to be the subject of the sentence. So and split into plural and singular. So the interesting thing here is, based on the underlying model that you're trying to optimize, it kind of finds a different projection that still kind of makes sense based on the problem that you're trying to handle. So yeah, basically the conclusion of this is, how can we harness the power of neural networks and still get kind of things that are interpretable or interesting to us? The answer is neural network, our answer anyway, is neural network-based learning on top of latent structured representations. And how can we learn on unlabeled data? The first two things were structured variational autoencoders for semi-supervised learning, and then we also had structured priors and invertible transformations for unsupervised learning. So yeah, I guess that's all I have today. Are there any final things that people want to ask about in general? So I think this went pretty fast, but if there are things in here that people are interested in, feel free to take a look at the papers or send an email to me and the people who worked on these. And we're all here a lot of the time, so we're happy to describe in more detail. So, okay, great. I'll finish up. Thanks a lot. It's a class. You don't necessarily have to clap.